Friday's proceedings in the trial of the Coutts Three essentially revolved around one witness from the Crown, an RCMP officer with 20 years of experience. His name is Mark Wilgosh. Robert Kraychik here in Lethbridge, Alberta, reporting for Rebel News.
Open air funeral proceedings were restricted.
Yeah.
There was capacity on open air funerals. Thankfully, I never went through that, but I know people where the grandchildren of grandparents who died in Picture Butte could not attend the open air funerals of their grandparents. That's what we were there for.
Controlling the situation down there. It was a group decision on everything that happened down there. So we were not the leadership of deciding, whether we're going or coming. I tried to go. I tried to get the crowd convinced to go home. But it was not up to me. That was the crowd's decision as to what they were going to do.
The three defendants, dubbed the Coutts Three, Marco van Hugenbos, Alex van Herk, and George Jansen, are being accused of mischief over $5,000 for their involvement, their participation in the Coutts blockade protest demonstration of 2022, a sort of sister protest alongside the Freedom Convoy in Ottawa, Ontario. The two demonstrations were peaceful. They involved civil disobedience and were motivated by broad opposition to what I refer to as the COVID-19 enterprise, mandates, orders, edicts issued by government and different industry, ostensibly in pursuit of protecting public health in the context of COVID-19. One feature of this trial that I want to share with you folks, and admittedly, this does reflect some professional chauvinism on my part, is that every single video introduced as an evidentiary exhibit in this trial has been a Rebel News video. In other words, every video that's played by either side, either the Crown or the defense teams, has that Rebel News watermark on it. Now, why is this interesting? I think in one part, it reflects the intersection of news media and politics and the justice system or judiciary. And also it reflects the very important work that Rebel News did on the ground in Coutts during this protest, during this demonstration and blockade, to capture the historical record. Also, Marco van Hugenbos, one of the defendants, joked with me in the hallway at one point that Rebel News was getting him in trouble. Of course, when we were more serious, we noted that it is important and protective of defendants to relay information as it occurred, as opposed to allowing others to characterize things that may not be captured on video. In other words, the closest and intimate observers can be to events as they occurred involves video, not transcription, not witness recollection, and it shows the importance of documenting things in real time. An interesting moment during the cross-examination of Mark Wilgosh took place when he was being questioned by Michael Johnston, legal defense counsel for Alex van Herk. So Johnston asked Wilgosh if his role as a sort of spokesperson or liaison or messenger for the RCMP in his work capacity at the Coutts protest amounted to Wilgosh himself being a sort of leader or controller of the RCMP. And the reason that Johnston asked that sort of rhetorical question was because the prosecution during its questioning of Wilgosh was emphasizing or highlighting the fact that Alex van Herk at different times during the protest appeared to speak on behalf of the protesters, or at least relay concerns to the RCMP as he understood them, as he saw them in the context of the protest. The reason Mark Wilgosh was invited to testify as a witness is because he operated as a sort of liaison officer for the RCMP in the capacity of the Coutts blockade and protest. So he dealt regularly with the protesters, including the three defendants. Now, testimony that he shared that was noteworthy was that there was no discernible leadership. He also said there was no clear leadership in his observations of the protest in his capacity as an RCMP liaison. Now, why is that important? It's important because one of the key arguments being made by the prosecution, by the Crown, is that the three defendants operated as a sort of leadership with a degree of control and influence over the protest itself. Mark Wilgosh also testified that when he was engaging in discussions or negotiations with the protest and dealing with Alex van Herk very often had to say that he had to correspond, he had to commune with the other protesters to get a sort of majority vote or consensus in order to determine how to proceed. And when I spoke with Alex Van Herk after the proceedings, I asked him about that moment, and Alex told me that that sort of democratic governance, if I can use that term loosely, within the context of the protest, reflected a lack of centralized leadership. It was indicative that there was no clear leader in that protest, that there was this back and forth constantly and this organic democratic dimension to the way the protesters decided how to proceed or not proceed, also in the context of negotiations with the RCMP. I also spoke with Marco van Hugenbos after the day's proceedings and invited him to remark on the context, the background of the protest, the rationale for the protesters, why they were there, what they were experiencing as Albertans when they made that decision to go to Coutts and do this demonstration. It's also reflective of things that were going on more broadly in the country. I also asked Marco to consider whether or not this context can be introduced into the trial to illuminate the jury with respect to this context that may be missed. And here's what he told me. I'm here with Marco van Hugenbos, one of the defendants in the Coutts Three. And Marco, we were speaking earlier about the context of the protest, the background, the rationale for it, and also some of the statements that you had made in the videos that were introduced as evidence by the prosecution. So on the first part, on the background, the motivation, the rationale of the protest, can you share with our audience some of that and sort of the motivation for what you guys were doing?
Yeah, in the last couple days, as these prosecutions have gone into full speed, there's been some videos played, and some of these, or a large part of these videos, include myself reading off speeches, announcements, speeches that I would have put together myself. And listening to these speeches and the emotion that I had in those speeches at that time, it really brought me back to the time 26 months ago where we were as a society and what drove us to that point. And I can relate to that, and that's why even during these proceedings and what will happen next week and the week after, there's going to be a lot of things that come to light as to things that happen a certain way, or things we said, or things we did. And to some degree, individuals may think there was some form of lawlessness, or we could be labeled as rednecks. We are country boys, so we do things that, we don't have government in our life the way we're talking pre 2020, right? Government did what they did, and policing did what they did, and we lived our lives. But it brings me back to the times. The emotion in those videos brings me back to the times we were living in, and that's what we need to remember. This may be a court of law, and the guardrails may be very close together, and they may not want to talk about why white-collar, blue-collar Albertans and Canadians were in Coutts. But I remember why we were there. I remember that what drove us there was the restrictions and the tyranny that was being put on the people. Visiting dying family members, grandparents, fathers and mothers. There was restrictions on that. If you weren't vaccinated, or restrictions in general as to large families could not attend the dying breaths of their loved ones. Open air funeral proceedings were restricted. Right. There was capacity on open air funerals. Thankfully, I never went through that, but I know people where the grandchildren of grandparents who died in Picture Butte could not attend the open air funerals of their grandparents. That's what we were there for. We were there for the seniors that were blockaded, and I'll say that word, blockaded and locked in their nursing homes, in their homes where they were being taken care of in their final moments. People who built this country, that's right. Veterans. And I say taken care of. That was lacking and limited at that time too, due to the restrictions. How much care? How many seniors across this country died alone? And that's why we were at Coutts. That's why when that freedom, and it wasn't just a few people. Yes, life went on, but when that freedom convoy rolled across this country, and when the Coutts protest evolved, there was tens of thousands, Hundreds of thousands of people came out. Canadians were angry. Canadians stood up. It's very un-Canadian to protest government. It's not something we do in this country. Yeah. It's not something I've seen in my 27 years here until the beginning of 2022.
I'm here with Alex Van Herk, one of the defendants in the Coutts Three trial. Proceedings just ended for Friday. So he's gracious enough to speak with me. Alex, let's talk about some of the testimony that we heard today from Mark Wilgosh, this RCMP officer that operated as a sort of liaison or communicator between the RCMP and you guys as the protesters. So he said several times that there was no discernible leadership. He said that when questioned by prosecutor Aaron Rankin. He also said that when questioned by your defense attorney, Michael Johnston. And I'm wondering, why is that important? Why is it meaningful that Wilgosh stated that there was no discernible leadership, at least during certain points of the protest?
Well, I think it was important, like he was trying to clarify, like there was a large group and it was hard to discern any type of leadership. When you get that kind of mass amounts of people that were supporting this thing, there was no definite leadership there. And it just was going to show that it was hard for them to decide who was leader or who wasn't, because there was so many different groups involved in that protest there, that there was no discernible leadership.
24 years I've lived in this country, and I've never seen a Canadian protest their government for what government did to them until this moment. So yes, we can talk about what we did and what happened and in what context and who leaders were. Leaders lead, and that's not in any way an admission of any kind, but leaders lead. And I'd say every individual that was involved in a movement, in a protest, to demand accountability from our government, to demand that this abuse, that this tyranny end, they led for the purposes that they led. And naturally there's structure and things like that evolve. But at this time, people have gone on with their lives, but we need to remember the times we were living in the spring of 2022. It was a dark, dark place. And thanks to the efforts of a few, such as Tamara Leach, Chris Barber, and many friends that I've met in the last 2 years that went to Ottawa, they inspired myself and my friends to go to that border and to change things in this province. So a jury may convict us, but the reasons why we were there, those convictions haven't changed.
Oh, by the way, one more note for the audience is that Wilgosh also testified that there were several factions involved in the protest, further sort of indicating this fragmented protest. Now, one more question on the same point about Wilgosh's testimony. He sort of indicated that you had said to him at one point during these back and forth communications or negotiations, if you'll accept that term, that you said you had to go back to the protesters and secure some sort of consensus or majority vote. Why is that important?
Well, it goes to show that we weren't controlling the situation down there. It was a group decision on everything that happened down there. So we were not the leadership of deciding, whether we're going or coming. I tried to go. I tried to get the crowd convinced to go home, but it was not up to me. That was the crowd's decision as to what they were going to do. I tried bringing a vote forward, say, guys, let's go home. I was shut down. So there was, it goes to show that there's no leadership there on anybody's part.
Now, you're giving us this background, this context, why we did it, what was at stake, what we were dealing with, the hardship, the tyranny. Is there a way to introduce that context into the trial so the jury can see the rationale, the motivation behind the protest itself?
It's very difficult. The way the court operates in relation to our prosecution, we're deemed innocent. It's a right under the charter, and the court, the Crown, is looking to find us guilty. With that being said, their submissions, their witnesses, they're the ones that lead this prosecution. We can respond to their witnesses, we can cross-examine them, we can contest the submissions they bring forward, but we do not lead the proceedings. We have very phenomenal counsel, right. And there's going to be a few things that counsel can bring in relation to the justification of or around the justification of some of our actions and the protest itself, or the conscientious side of things, but it's going to be very limited. There is one way that this does happen, and that involves me taking the witness stand. At this point, I haven't. I've gone into these proceedings with the mindset that I won't. I feel that it will allow the Crown to put me in positions that I'd rather not be in, or ask me questions that I might not be interested in asking, but once under oath, I'm obligated to.
So there was a video that was played, and we were talking about that earlier. What happened in that video, and how does that speak to this question of leadership?
Well, it goes very clearly. You'll see it in the video evidence that absolutely there was a vote brought forward that it was a unanimous decision that they were not listening to anybody. They were there on their own accord and had full intention of staying on their own accord.
But I feel that the negative of of me potentially being a witness is starting to be outweighed by the need to address this and to almost set the record straight on a few things that witnesses, law enforcement witnesses, and the previous mayor of Coutts have brought forward. Largely accurate testimony by those witnesses, but it's not even that the fact that it's not even about things being factual. It's about the context of the wording that's being used. There's an art to this, and I have some experience in being on the stand. I'm not saying I'm a professional, but let's just say I was a natural. Right. And my lawyer at the time when I was on the stand in Ottawa did say that, which is why I'm not looking to be a witness, but there may come a point where I feel, I'm not looking to take the stand, but there may come a point where I will take the stand to set the record straight on a few things and to inform the court, including the jury, on why we were there as law-abiding, white-collar and blue-collar Canadians.
So we're running two fundraising campaigns in relation to this trial. The first is to offset the legal costs for the defendants. You can help fund their defense fund by visiting Coutts3.com. And keep in mind, lawyers are not cheap and they are definitely not free. And if you do make a donation, you'll be issued a charitable receipt because this fundraiser is being administered by a partner organization of ours, a nonprofit known as the Democracy Fund, which is committed to protecting constitutional freedoms and liberties, which is, of course, clearly germane, relevant to this trial. Secondarily, we're running a fundraising campaign for our operational costs at Rebel News to produce this journalism. Primarily, that's for me, who came in from Ottawa. And while Lethbridge is not the most expensive city in the world, it is not New York City, it's not Tokyo, it's not Miami, it's still not free. And we at Rebel News depend on our generous viewers to contribute to continue doing this in-the-field original reporting. And you can help us out by visiting truckertrials.com.